Welcome back to the second part of an ongoing series about running Linux on the PlayStation, PSX, PS1 or whatever you want to call it. You all know this lovely grey machine. In the previous video I basically picked up the Linux distribution, which is loosely based around the UC Linux project, which is a microcontroller version of Linux specifically built with no memory management unit in the kernel, and took it for a short spin. UC Linux has been stuck in hiatus for years, and Linux has been dead since the early 2000s. It's roughly 20 years later, so I think it's time to have a look at it again. I was happy to see there was a lot of interest in this project, no matter how trivial or redundant it is, so thank you for that. I'm sorry this video didn't come out faster, but today's video is just more of an update to what I've been up to and why I haven't really made any new videos recently. I've had all kinds of feedback from users which offered me quite a bit of insight in how we might achieve this project. So today we're going to look at some of the required tools, consoles, tool chains, and where I was a few months ago with this project. Hopefully the follow-up video is not too far away behind this one. Okay, so first off, the console I was testing the current build of Linux on via the serial port is actually a newer PU22 console built in 1998. The issue with this console, even though it does have a parallel port, is it doesn't have the same little memory chips as required in the Tri-Mesh and Shadow upgrade over at the PSXDEVNet, which requires a PU18 console. So I hit the dirty streets of Marketplace and eBay to find a PU18 console, and I hit the jackpot. This little bag of random goodies included memory cards, a multi-port boomerang, which I've not seen one of these since the late 90s, early 2000s, and I even scored some PowerPlay parallel port adapters, which could come in handy later down the road for this project. I have two of these PowerPlay units, and I'm thinking perhaps another way we could achieve some extra memory or some kind of extra storage system would be via the parallel port, with some kind of customized PCB that we can design and take the I/O port off this and connect it to the console. The PlayStation parallel port can handle up to 3 megabytes per second on the system bus. The original CD-ROM at 2x speed could read a maximum of 352 kilobytes a second, so there's plenty of bandwidth there available for such an idea. And for those people horrified by my brutal destruction of the serial port cable, you'll be happy to know that this little bundle came with an untouched fresh cable, so we have a backup and a PS2 multi-port adapter. One of the reasons it took so long to do this video was finding those parts, plus I spent a fair bit of time searching high and low for some replacement chips which would give us 8 megabytes or even 4 megabytes from places like eBay, Mouser and DigiKey to see if they had any similar components to do this upgrade with. They had either nothing, or you had to buy in bulk, like a minimum of 1,000 chips, which wasn't really financially viable or practical for me. Now let's get into this episode. We need to take a look at this PU18 console. It doesn't power up, which is of considerable concern, and we really need it to work for this project, so I decided we needed to get it under the scope and have a closer look to see what's going on here. Looking around the board here, you can see this BTL driver has suffered some kind of intense heat issue at some point, and on the other side of the board here you can see the voltage regulator looks a little cooked, so we might have to swap that out and test some of these fuses, and we'll talk about the memory upgrade plan. Finding replacement chips that would give us 4 or 8 megabytes of RAM wasn't easy, and then I thought, what about my old 486 system, which in fact has EDO memory and the same amount of pins that we need? I'm a little bit sad about this because I love my 486, but for the sake of this project it needs to be done. So I got to work and pulled the memory chips off this EDO DIMM. Here is the original pinout of the KM48 chips, which have 28 pins, and here is the intended Mitsubishi replacement chips. Now we're going to have to remap these pins to make this work in line with the Shadow and Tri-Mesh upgrade. The next obvious step was to remove the KM48 memory chips from out of the console, but I kind of screwed this up as I forgot to turn my iron down when I was cleaning the pads up, and I rushed it after a few too many whiskies by this point. So here comes a quality bodge special repair, and while I'm fixing this, I guess it's a good time to talk about some of the goals of this project. Number one obviously being getting the hardware ready for use and making sure the console actually works. Followed by number two, it's got to be compiling the kernel on my Ubuntu 20 system, which I will talk about a little bit later in this video. Number three is probably testing the new kernel, perhaps in the no cache emulator, or even just testing it on real hardware just to see what happens when we get to that point. Number four will be probably the biggest major milestone in this project, and that is all about storage, the init.rd, the root file system, and getting the kernel to find the root file system so it no longer screams at us. Now, the research I've done in regards to the file systems and all that sort of stuff is the Linux team had a RAID set up across the memory cards to achieve this root file system, which is funny because even with 8 cards you'll only get 1 megabyte of storage, which isn't a lot, but it might be enough to get something like BusyBox to load, or something else running on a really basic sort of system, and we might even have to look at the potential of a RAM disk as well. Yeah, yikes. It's pretty rough, but let's get the chips on and test for continuity to make sure everything is making the connections to where they need to go. Right, the chips are on. Now, this image shows how Trimesh and Shadow remapped their chips on their console, so I'm basically following their guide to a T. Believe it or not, I tested the continuity of these chips to the vias and it all looks good, so in the next video we will look at the next step of connecting them up to get our 8 megabyte upgrade completed. I looked at these components a little earlier and I'm a little bit worried that they might be cooked here. The board was a little dirty, so I'm going to put it in the ultrasonic cleaner and give it a bit of a clean and see what it comes out like. And as I'm going over the board here, just checking for dirty bits and nitty gritty, grimy, yucky stuff here, I started to wonder if someone spilt something on it in the past, or if some caps had popped, leaving this mess behind. And you can see I'm sort of cleaning this stuff up here, and as I'm going over it, I think I found what could possibly be the underlying issue of why this board's not working here. And I came across some broken traces and some missing pads and potentially some missing components that might have been ripped off the board. I'm not entirely sure, but if memory serves me correctly, I think this board was once chipped, and I think perhaps someone spilt something on it and cooked it, and then they must have removed the chip from the system perhaps. And after looking at a picture of the board, the only thing I need to fix here is these pads and traces that have been damaged to get this console working again potentially. But you never know what other damage may have occurred and what components might need replacing, but we can get into that next time. So that's probably going to do it for this hardware sort of console part of the video today. Now let's look into the kernel side of the project. Blackroo Linux is going to be a continuation of the Linux system, and I'll create a Git repo when I have something good to upload, and I have created a fresh readme file which contains the process I used to get the toolchain working on Ubuntu. I installed the toolchain on my system and I was able to get the kernel to compile using the generic settings for the Alpha 2 version of Linux, but there's still a lot of work to be done here. I instantly hit roadblocks and went back to the PSXDEVNet to see other users had experienced these issues before too. So there's a lot of good things to find there. From those guys who have done a lot of the groundwork picking up the pieces that weren't really well documented by the Linux team. And I've been talking to these guys in the group, and I've tried to mount the PSX memory cards on my PlayStation 2 using Blackroo Linux, but no luck so far, as I'm pretty sure the PS2 Linux versions lack the modules that mount the file system of the PSX memory cards anyway. So looking into the kernel configuration application, this allows you to customize the kernel and add some of the options available for this kernel, such as the memory card support, the RAID support, file system support, RAM disk support, serial I/O support, and apparently even USB support, which is rumored to be working. Apparently you need to use the SIO feature to remote log into the Linux system via console, and there is no video output by the actual machine, which is kind of interesting. But from what I've read, there was also no CD-ROM support, which is a little bit of a pain in the butt, but we can probably create a bootable disk to load a lot of this stuff off and load up a RAM file system or something like that later on at some point. And if I had to guess, I'd say this was a big pain in the butt, because you need these adapters, you need all this memory, so that's probably why this project was never quite mainstream. So for the last part of this video, I wanted to take some time to look at the root file system and the initRD files listed here. So the Linux img file is the initRD boot system for Linux. And you can also see here that we have an ext2 root file system and even a fat file system. So that needs to be installed onto this RAID setup somehow, or perhaps directly into the memory cards once we have more RAM working, which is an option in the kernel configuration program anyway. The file size of the initRD is actually only 918 kilobytes, so it's quite possible to get that loaded into memory or even across the RAID configuration, which will be the next hard part of this project anyway. So when you use the kernel configuration program, it'll actually ask you to define the size of the root or RAM file system rather, before loading that into the memory. And it's quite interesting here because the root file system is only 1.8 megabytes, so that's quite easily going to fit into our upgraded machine. And I'm not sure if that would really fit into a stock standard sort of PlayStation either. With the kernel loaded, you'd pretty much run out of memory rather quickly, I'd think. But just looking around the root file system here, it's got all the makings for what you'd expect from a standard sort of Linux distro. So I mean, I think it's very viable, even if we have to use the console to log in via the serial port and all that, and try and figure out video stuff later. But the main part of this project is just to get this thing finding the root file system again. So now that I have most of the components I believe that we need, it's just a matter of going through these documents here that I'm looking at now, and it gives you a lot of insight actually on how it calls stuff up, how you set your root file system and how you can set your RAM file system and all that sort of stuff. And even in that file there, you can see that it had some kind of internet connectivity. And it's an interesting read because this stuff's pretty old. I mean, these are dated from 2007, and the 0.1 version is 2006. So these are pretty old files. That's probably going to do it for this video, and I'm not far off finishing the third episode in this series, which has a lot more to offer, but this is where I'm kind of at the start of this year. So it's just a matter of time and work and life and actually getting it done. So like and subscribe and have yourself a whiskey.